This is your ultimate stop for everything sports. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Should I say more? From the NFL, MLB, the NBA to MMA, it's all in here. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Listen now.
Thank you for listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast, where we discuss the latest and greatest news in the world of sports. I'm Ben. As many of you know, Alex is in San Diego right now. He's at Comic-Con. In our last episodes, you know that he went down there. San Diego Comic-Con, really the biggest Comic-Con convention in all of the world, so I'm really excited for him. He's a big comic guy. He's going to a concert as well, so I'm going to be flying solo on this show and our next show, but we do have our first guest of the GSMC Sports Podcast. So, Alex, I'm sorry, but we're doing a first without you. Anyway, so we're going to be covering on the show today, going to be talking Brock Lesnar. He failed yet another drug test right after UFC 200, his win over Mark Hunt. Going to be moving on to Odell Beckham and Josh Norman. They had quite a feud yesterday. Odell Beckham said something about Josh Norman in a interview he's doing for GQ magazine, which will be released next month. Going to end the show with Tim Duncan Day and something Shaquille O'Neal, NBA Hall of Famer, said about Duncan, and that he does not consider him one of the best NBA big men. But without further ado, going to introduce our first guest here. It is Mr. Andrew Tate. Tate is in charge of the whole GSMC podcast network, as well as our MMA podcast and our fantasy football podcast here. Tate, thanks for joining me here.
How's it going, people?
Thanks for joining me.
Now, how does Alex get to go to Comic-Con, but I get to be stuck here with you guys?
I mean, I don't know. Maybe you should do Comic-Con next year or something.
I'm all about that.
I don't know. Like he's doing a concert down there too. He's going to like a Blink-182, a Day to Remember concert too. So he's super excited.
Oh, Alex is doing it up then.
Yeah, like interesting enough, we had to delay the start of the shows because I was on vacation because I went to Mexico, or else we would have started the shows about a week earlier. So I had my vacation, and then now Alex is on his. So
when do I get my vacation?
Oh, really? Whenever you want. You're the boss here. So I mean, whenever you really want.
No.
All right, anyway, so Brock Lesnar here, he has failed yet another drug test. The former UFC heavyweight champion is believed to have tested positive for the same substance in both tests. We really are not sure because the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency has not released the name of it. What do you think about this, Tate?
Well, first off, am I really surprised? No.
That he failed the second test?
Well,
or just in general?
Well, there's the A sample and B sample both came back positive. But traditionally, when you're talking about an A sample and B sample, they're both taken at the exact same time. So there's no shock there. The thing about Brock's test is this. He was tested a number of times throughout the whole process. His first two tests came up positive. And then I think after that, he came through with a series of clean tests. And then I think his final test ended up being popped as tainted again. So, it's kind of this big trend, and as a matter of fact, it's kind of funny that I'm in here today because on the MMA podcast, we're talking about that same subject because yesterday, everyone's talking about Brock Lesnar, everyone's talking about John Jones, but then it was announced that Chad Mendes, who was a former two-time champion, he's been suspended for 2 years for the same kind of situation. So the UFC definitely has an issue. Some people keep saying it's a tainted supplement, but that's just too many people getting popped.
Yeah, and it's believed that reports are that Lesnar tested positive for an anti-estrogen blocker, which is clomiphene, which is reportedly flagged in John Jones's blood as well.
Now, I can tell you this about that particular an estrogen blocker. Do you know what it's used for?
No.
Okay.
Not at least as far as fighting is concerned.
Well, it's actually more of a testosterone situation. What happens is a lot of times, first on the illegal substance portion of it, when you're taking testosterone, the first thing that happens is you get injected with the testosterone. It really spikes your testosterone level, and so your body naturally tries to compensate by boosting up your estrogen level. Well, you don't want that to happen, because when you come off, your estrogen levels will stay high, your testosterone levels will be low. So right after you take a shot of testosterone, you traditionally take an estrogen blocker to keep your estrogen levels low, but keep your testosterone levels up. So it helps you with working out, building muscle, recovery, things like that. Now, in defense of all these guys, one of the things that's a new trend that's going on is that a lot of the new supplements are actually starting to add in estrogen blockers, helping so that you use your natural testosterone levels but lower your estrogen levels to help you with your workout. So that's one of the things that's kind of going on nowadays.
Okay. So what do you sort of make of this whole thing as far as Brock Lesnar is concerned, the UFC is concerned? Because had Brock Lesnar have not failed any tests, I would see that there's no shadow of a doubt that he stays in the UFC after his victory over Mark Hunt. But now with the uncertainty here with the failed test, what do you make of his future in the UFC and maybe the UFC as a whole? You have Chad Mendes suspended for 2 years, John Jones a bad test, and Brock Lesnar as well.
Well, that's an interesting question. The first thing is, if Brock is suspended for 2 years, his MMA career is over.
Yeah, he's 39 years old, so he'd be 41. He'd be done.
Yes, he's a hot commodity right now, but he's still not even the same guy that when he first came into UFC. He has slowed a little bit even now. Take 2 years off from there, and you can end any thought of Brock Lesnar like contending for a title. But if you look at it and you say, as far as WWE goes, I don't think it really affects his WWE status, because it's been known for a while that a lot of the WWE stars have been been using steroids, from Vince McMahon all the way to his son Shane, to Randy Orton, to they've
Triple H, son-in-law.
They've all been popped with steroids. So the steroid use in the WWE doesn't affect Brock Lesnar's career.
Okay, so one guy who's not happy about this whole thing is Mark Hunt, who Brock Lesnar defeated at UFC 200. He has been absolutely irate. He stated that he wanted his UFC contract terminated if he was not given a share of Lesnar's purse, which was about $2.5 million. He is absolutely furious.
And I talked about this on my show, and I was thinking about this. There's two parts of this one. The first one is, if Brock Lesnar, let's say the same thing that went down with John Jones and Cormier. When Cormier first found out that John Jones had popped, the first thing came out of Cormier's mouth is, what do I need to do? I'm willing to sign whatever it takes. This was a big payday for Mark Hunt. If, let's say, Brock Lesnar would have popped beforehand, would Mark Hunt been willing to sign a waiver to fight Brock Lesnar? I would have probably said yes.
Yeah, because I kind of compare it to people that are fighting like Floyd Mayweather or Manny Pacquiao. They know that they're probably not going to win. They know they're not getting a fair share amount of the purse, but they're getting their name out there being on a high-profile pay-per-view. I kind of compare that with Mark Hunt.
Well, I disagree. Mark Hunt was the favorite. Mark Hunt.
But do you think that has to do with Lesnar's time off? Had Lesnar been consistently fighting, do you think that'd be different?
No, I would have still taken Mark Hunt.
Okay.
I admit I was wrong. But the reason why I took Hunt was the fact that Mark Hunt has is one of the most powerful punchers in the UFC.
He could punch through any brick wall in this whole building.
Yes, and Brock has shown that he doesn't like to be hit. So I personally think the one thing that Brock did in that fight was the fact that he made sure that to eliminate Mark Hunt's power by staying at a distance, charging in, and taking him to the ground to eliminate that power factor. If that fight stands up, I don't care how many times they fight. If the fight stay as a stand-up battle, Hunt still knocks him out.
I'm surprised that fight went all 5 rounds. I thought for sure we would have had a first round, second round knockout between one of the two guys. Because Lesnar's had the ability to take people down and then finish them on the ground. And we mentioned Hunt's punching power. I'm surprised it went all 5 rounds. You know,
and I actually, with my prediction, I actually had Hunt winning like early in the first round. And so you can see how wrong I was. But, you know, if it was going to be Lesnar, I thought Brock would take him to the ground, wear him out, and then finish him into like the second round if it went that way. But so I do agree. I think everyone thought it was going to be a knockout.
But Alex and I have talked about it on our show before when we covered things like UFC 200. I feel like MMA in a whole is probably one of the hardest things to predict because you have that uncertainty when you have...
Absolutely.
Like, think about Conor McGregor, Jose Aldo. Aldo hasn't lost in a decade. McGregor hits him once and finishes the fight. You can get caught one time and be completely done.
I've seen so many fights where, you know, even when you look at Michael Bisping, he's now the champ, but
took him almost forever to get there.
Yes, but there's just no way that he should have won that fight. But that's the one thing about MMA is it doesn't matter whether it's the first round or the last round. I've seen guys lose all 3 rounds. And then get a lucky shot off, and it's over. Or you look at Miesha Tate versus Holly Holm. Holly was clearly winning the fight, winning it clearly. But a rear naked choke later, only like 30 seconds left, less than a minute left in the fight. The fight's over.
Look at the first fight between Anderson Silva and Chael Sonnen. Another example.
There's another
Chael
example.
Sonnen took him down every single round, dominated him on the ground. Anderson Silva catches him in a choke in the last round, like last case scenario, and wins the fight. The second fight was a lot different. Anderson Silva dominated him. But that first fight, Chael Sonnen, there's no way he should have lost the fight, and then he got caught 1 quick second and gets choked out.
But that's what makes the UFC so great. And with boxing, and I didn't mean to make this a whole, UFC
No, we're good. We're good.
Okay. With boxing, that's what's kind of killed boxing, not to mention the lack of major fights. But once someone gets a lead, a lot of times you can sit through another 5, 6, 7 rounds of just a little pity pat here, nothing happens. You can watch your favorite fighter, your favorite fighter can be dominating all the way through. It could be the 3rd round with 2 minutes left, and you're still hanging on your seat because you're not sure until that final bell sounds that your guy's going to win.
Yeah, absolutely. I look at boxing. I look at Floyd Mayweather. Really, the way he does it is so defensive, and he has such quick hands. He's probably one of the greatest defensive fighters of all time. But he'll win a few rounds. He'll kind of dance around, win another few rounds, dance around, and win the fight. Yeah. In UFC, you don't really have that aspect because you're one quick takedown away, you're one quick leg kick away, a stomach, an elbow,
there's
whatever.
So many things that can change, and that's the reason why the UFC, just one of many reasons why the UFC sold for $4 billion, is the fact that it's the fastest growing sport because everyone's looking for action, and the UFC delivers action.
The UFC keeps developing too. You have UFC, and now you add women into it. You add more weight classes. And
here's the crazy thing: I actually like the women better than the men nowadays.
That happens a lot of times. I'm not surprised. A lot of people do feel that way. So with the men, there's a lot more names. With the women, you have not as many names, but it's definitely still developing. That's what I find interesting about the UFC. Is it sold for $4 billion. The Fertitta brothers sold it for $4 billion. They bought it for $2 million 16 years ago. So they got quite a return on their investment, for one. For two, if you wait think about what the UFC could be in 10 more years.
Well, I talked about that. Even with this purchase, a couple things that they're looking at doing. The first thing is, William Morris actually could make their money back within the next 2 years. That entire $4 billion, they can make their money back easily, just by one of their big goals is to get into China. If you open up the China market, the UFC doubles, if not triples, in size. Then you figure in the next couple of years, because it's the fastest growing sport, the Fox deal is up, and you don't think ABC and ESPN's want to get into the ESPN?
It's going to be a bidding war.
Absolutely. You think the NBA ended up getting a great contract? Wait till you see this next UFC contract.
Yeah, because UFC, I kind of compare it in a way to WWE. WWE is more of a monopoly of wrestling. I feel like with UFC, it's not as high because you have a lot of different things. You have like Bellator,
World Series.
Yeah, you know all the names.
One championship. There's a bunch of them.
But with you kind of compared it to the NBA, you're going to have CBS, you're going to have Fox, ABC, NBC. You're going to have all these.
They all want to get in the game too.
You're going to have all these companies bidding for UFC because UFC, you have UFC on Fox, you have FS1 of like Tough Enough, you have all these things where it can sort of develop not just your main channel, but your sort of branching networks as well.
So now when you think about the money, the revenue stream, and you think about China, you think about the bidding war that you're talking about with all the different networks. Now, the Reebok deal that the UFC has, that when that deal's up, it's been a huge success for Reebok. You don't think Nike and Under Armour are going to want to get a piece of that?
Nike, Under Armour, Adidas, all of them.
Exactly. The UFC is in a place right now where over the next 3 or 4 years, they're in one bidding war after the next bidding war after the next bidding war. They're going to clean up.
Yeah, and that's what I was saying. Like if you think about where UFC could be in 10 years, you could look at, oh wow, they only bought it for $4 billion. Like now it could be. You look at some of the
billion.
You look at some of the highest franchises, like the Cowboys are ranked number 1 at like worth $4 billion. You have teams like Real Madrid and Barcelona, Manchester United, which are right below them. But UFC, it could be even higher than all of them. And it's not necessarily a franchise; it's more of an organization. But still,
right. Well, you look around and you look at if you projected the money. Just do you remember how much the NBA agreement was for?
I'm not sure off the top of my head. I might be able to look it up. Right.
And you're looking at I predict that they're going to get just as much money as the NBA received for their deal. And I don't remember how much the NBA deal was for, but this investment's going to look small after, especially if they get China before this deal opens up. If you get China, roll it right into the television deal, right into the apparel deal, you're looking at a situation where you're looking at, now the top 4 sports being NFL, NBA, MLB, UFC.
So it looks like the NBA struck a 9-year deal for $24 billion with ESPN and Turner Sports. And
I'm thinking, and I say that's about what I think the UFC is going to end up with.
I would not be surprised. Like $4 billion is obviously a lot, but if you compare it to what could be, it's going to be nothing.
No, it was a great investment in my opinion.
Right. And UFC, you mentioned the fastest growing sport in America, and it's really taken over boxing.
Boxing's getting left in.
Everyone's wanting to be a UFC fighter, an MMA artist instead of a boxer. So it's only going to go up from here, and it's good for America. We need more sports. It seems like really NFL, college football dominate. The NBA, I'm kind of on the fence with because the thing I struggle with the NBA is if you can look at now. You can count on one hand how many teams you realistically think can win the championship, then why am I going to watch it during the middle of the season? And with MMA, it's not like that. You have guys coming out of nowhere become champions within a year.
Yes, and here's the thing, and I feel like we're recapping my show that we just did, but I mean, which is perfect, though. When you look at the UFC, it's the fastest growing sport in the United States. It's the second fastest growing sport in Latin America.
You have the Brazilian influence in UFC.
You go Europe. It's one of the fastest growing sports in Europe. Asia, it's one of the fastest growing sports. So unlike football, where it's just the U.S., and basketball where it's primarily China, China, Europe, U.S. There's not a continent out there other than Africa that the UFC is not one of the fastest growing sports in. So you when you mix that in, it's amazing how much where you can kind of look at where this sport could actually grow to.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting, and we'll always have to keep you updated here at the GSMC Podcast Network. Tate on the MMA podcast, myself and Alex on the Sports Podcast, because there's always news coming up with UFC all the time. You have pay-per-views monthly, UFC on Fox's, Tough Enough competitions. They really have done a good job of evolving the sport from just the one pay-per-view events to adding multiple things, get people to stay interested in it. So that's definitely a good thing that the Fertittas, Dana White, all the people at UFC have done.
Now, one last thing I'm going to say, I don't mean to take up too much of your time.
No, we're good. But
I want you to think about this as well. The one thing that the UFC has done that makes them very comparable to the NFL, and that is this. the UFC has figured out that they own Saturdays. During the football season, you get up, you watch your college football game, you relax, and then you wrap your day up on a Saturday night with a big UFC fight. When college football is over, there's nothing else. It's just UFC on Saturdays.
That's an interesting point. I've never thought about that because I kind of compare it in a way. With me, I'm a big wrestling guy. Mm-hmm. The NFL obviously dominates Sundays, but you have a lot of things on Sundays. You have the NFL, you have NASCAR, you have like golf tournaments winding down like the Masters, and then you have the WWE. At the nighttime, you have the pay-per-views. You have the WrestleManias of the world, the SummerSlams. So I haven't thought about that. That's an interesting point.
It's college football during the football season. It's just college football and MMA, and when college football is over, it's just the MMA. It's an
interesting point. I haven't thought about that, but you do make up a good point with there. Yeah. That's a good point. All right, so we're going to take our first break here at the Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. I want to thank again my guest Tate here for joining me. We had a nice little back and forth talk there about Brock Lesnar and UFC as a whole. So we're going to take our first break. We'll be right back. We're going to talk Josh Norman and Odell Beckham Jr. So we'll be right back here at the Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Alex, you don't have your six shooters because you are not here. Alex, once again, in San Diego for Comic-Con, as well as a Blink-182 and a Day to Remember concert. Have to fill in on how he enjoyed his vacation down there. Again, so I would like to thank Andrew Tate, the host of our MMA podcast here, as well as the Fantasy Football podcast, for joining me in the last segment talking Brock Lesnar with his second bad drug test, as well as some MMA, UFC as a whole news. I'd like to thank him. We had a great exchange there. Going to transition here really quickly. We have some games going on currently. The Dodgers have a 2-1 lead over the Nationals in the third inning. Dodgers, some unfortunate news recently, having Clayton Kershaw really be out what could be up until September with that back injury. Kind of rushed it back, and now the question is whether is he sort of pushed it back to where it was day one, or has he rushed it back and made it even worse? So we're really not sure. Dodgers manager Dave Roberts did say that he could be facing surgery. Have to fill you in here at the GSMC Sports Podcast, as always, on Kershaw and the Dodgers. But we're going to transition here. Going to be talking some NFL news, talking Josh Norman, recently acquired Redskins cornerback, I'm sorry. Thinking soccer here. And then also Odell Beckham Jr., Giants wide receiver. He said something very interesting yesterday in an interview for the GQ magazine. He mentioned that he thinks the reason that Josh Norman has become so relevant is because of me, speaking Beckham, about an GQ issue that will be published in August. He also went to say that Josh Norman is in Washington because of him, and he called it a smart business move, as well as the fact that they gave him $15 million a season. Josh Norman didn't really have anything to say about this, but Beckham also went on to say, it goes back to what I was saying. If I wasn't playing him twice a year, maybe people wouldn't bring it up as much, but now it'll be a lot more media attention for him, and attention that I don't really look for, nor attention I really don't need. I've found this very, very interesting. First off, I'm going to talk about Josh Norman. I find him in Washington to be very interesting, and I want to see how he really does, because not only is he going to go up against Odell Beckham twice a year, he's also going to be going up against Dez Bryant of the Cowboys twice a year. Josh Norman, he's been in the NFL for 4 years now. He only has 7 interceptions over his whole career. He had 4 last year, so really a breakout year for him. You could kind of say, is he maybe a product of the Carolina Panthers system? You have Ron Rivera, former linebacker, part of the 85 Bears Super Bowl winning team, and what most people say as the greatest single-season defense of all time in the NFL. So you have a great mentor in Ron Rivera. You have, in my opinion, the best middle linebacker in the NFL in Luke Kuechly. You also have people like Thomas Davis, Star Lotulelei, Coney Ely on that defensive line. So you have a great, great defense there in Carolina. And then you add Josh Norman in. Is he really a shutdown corner, which he showed last year, or is he really just a product of that system? So we'll have to find out what Norman does at the nation's capital with the Redskins. But anyways, moving on to Odell Beckham, I found what he said rather interesting. First off, he goes on to talk about how he doesn't really like to do media attention. It's not attention that he really looks for or needs. Really, Odell? If you didn't need the media attention, then why would you be saying this? All you're doing is bringing attention towards yourself. You're doing an interview for GQ magazine. That's bringing media attention towards yourself. You were on the cover of the Madden NFL football game last year. That's bringing media attention towards yourself. You recently were in Germany with Bayern Munich, the best soccer team in Germany, hanging out with them, doing some videos. You're bringing attention to yourself, but yet you talk to GQ and you don't bring any media attention towards yourself. I don't really understand that. As well, I'm not really a big fan of Odell Beckham, period. Everyone looks at the game last year between the Panthers and the Giants. The Giants ended up losing that game after they had a huge lead. The Panthers came back and won that game. So the Giants really got shut down in that game, especially Odell Beckham Jr., by Josh Norman until, really, the fourth quarter. Odell Beckham had a good fourth quarter, caught a touchdown. But back and forth that whole game, Norman and Beckham had a feud. There were multiple personal foul penalties, and Beckham actually got suspended for their next game because of everything that happened in that game. A lot of jawing, a lot of back and forth. It's going to be interesting to see how they do matched up twice a year now. Being in the NFC East, they're both going to play each other 2 games, one in New York and one in D.C. But anyways, Odell Beckham, I feel like you are kind of an anomaly. Because, one, you got to thank all your success. You're talking about that Josh Norman success is because of you. You got to thank all your success due to Eli Manning. Without Eli Manning, without a great quarterback, I don't believe you are who you are today. Look at some of the best wide receivers over recent times. In my opinion, the best wide receiver in the NFL right now is Antonio Brown of the Steelers. I don't think anyone would question that at all. Antonio Brown last year had 1,800 yards, as well as 10 touchdowns. He had 136 receptions. Look at some of Antonio Brown's games. They opened up against New England. He had 9 catches for 133 yards and a touchdown. Next week out, they play the Niners. 9 catches, 195 yards and a touchdown. They play the Rams in week 3, 108 yards, 11 receptions. Then what happens to Ben Roethlisberger? He gets injured. You have Michael Vick come in. Next game, they lose to Baltimore in overtime. Antonio Brown, 5 catches, 42 yards. Next game, against the Chargers, 3 catches, 45 yards. 3 catches, 24 yards against the Cardinals. Then look at when Roethlisberger comes back a few weeks later. Against the Raiders, 17 catches, 284 yards. Next week against the Browns, 10 catches, 139 yards, and 2 touchdowns. Later in the year, they played the Denver Broncos, Super Bowl winning Denver Broncos, one of the best defenses of all time by many people's standards. He lit them up. 16 catches, 189 yards, 2 touchdowns. Look at what Antonio Brown's doing with Ben Roethlisberger, and look at what he's doing without him. I'll give you some more examples. I'll stick with the Giants. Victor Cruz. Victor Cruz, undrafted out of UMass. They have some injuries go down. Victor Cruz has a 200-yard game. Then Victor Cruz becomes one of the best wide receivers in the NFL. Is that on Victor Cruz or is that on Eli Manning? Don't get me wrong. These guys have to get open. They have to run routes. They have to beat their man off the line. But wide receivers, in my opinion, are really only as good as the quarterback who's throwing them the ball. Larry Fitzgerald is a guy who comes to mind. He was a good wide receiver coming out of Pittsburgh. He put up good numbers. He gets Kurt Warner. They go to the Super Bowl. They ended up losing to the Steelers, but they go to the Super Bowl. He comes back. He starts having some injuries at QB. They have John Skelton. They have Ryan Lindley. Larry Fitzgerald's just another guy. Julian Edelman was a quarterback in college for Kent State. He comes into the Patriots with Tom Brady. He is Wes Welker 2.0. Quick, over the middle, make one move, get 8 yards. Julian Edelman is one of the best wide receivers, in my opinion, because of Tom Brady in the system. Wes Welker came over from Miami. Tom Brady made him unguardable. Odell Beckham has made some great catches in his life. I think of that catch against the Cowboys, the one-handed catch. But Odell Beckham, if you're talking about Josh Norman only being as good and only getting media coverage because of you, shouldn't you think about that you're only getting coverage and you're only as good as you are because of Eli Manning? I mean, come on, man. Let's be serious here. It's going to be interesting to see what happens in the 2 games they play, as well as against the Cowboys for Washington as he matches up against Dez Bryant. Interested to see if Josh Norman is really a shutdown corner, or is he really a product of the Carolina Panthers system? Anyways, we're going to take another break here at the Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. We're going to jump back in after the break talking some Tim Duncan news. Today is Tim Duncan Day, July 21st in San Antonio. There's quite a few discounted items, depending on restaurants, if you're in the San Antonio area, I'm going to tell you about, as well as something that NBA Hall of Famer Shaquille O'Neal said about Duncan on his podcast show on Monday. So we'll be right back here. Don't you go anywhere, guys, at the Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast.
Check out the show that's built on the MMA. From the UFC to extreme cage fighting, they got the fights covered. Check out the GSMC MMA podcast. Get the latest news on past or upcoming fights. Join us as we talk to and about some of the biggest names in the MMA, past, present, and future. When it's the fight game, there's just one show to check out. GSMCpodcast.com/MMA-podcast. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
And welcome back into the Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. I'm Ben. As many of you know, Alex is not here today, as well as he won't be here for our next show. He's in San Diego. I'm going to give some love here to Mr. Tate for joining me in our first segment of the day with our MMA podcast, as well as our fantasy football podcast. We're talking some Brock Lesnar news, as well as UFC news. Now going to jump into Tim Duncan Day. Today, July 21st, has been coined the very first annual Tim Duncan Day. Recently retired San Antonio Spurs legend Tim Duncan won 5 championships with the San Antonio Spurs, spent all of his 19 seasons in the NBA as well as San Antonio. There's some interesting news going on if you are a resident of the San Antonio area. So if you will go to Taco Cabana, customers will be able to reply to a Facebook post using hashtag Tim Duncan Day with a photo of themselves in Spurs gear at a Taco Cabana between 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. for a chance to win one of 7 $21 Taco Cabana gift cards. They'll be drawn randomly at any time during the day. So hopefully, if you're listening, you are taking advantage of that, as well as if you go to places like McDonald's in honor of Tim Duncan Day in the San Antonio area. They'll be selling 21-piece McNugget boxes instead of 20-piece McNugget boxes. That offer will be going until Thursday, July 21st. So you have 10 days to jump on there to go to McDonald's, get a 21-piece McNugget box instead of 20, as well as El Chris Martha's. The restaurant will be offering 21-cent bean and cheese tacos. There's a limit of 5 per person from 7 a.m. to 10 a.m., so that offer's obviously already gone on. It will also offer 2 cheese enchiladas served with rice and beans for $2.10 and house margaritas for $2.10 all day. So if you had a stressful day, maybe a stressful night the night before, you can go down to El Chris Martha's, get a house margarita for $2.10, as many as you like all day. So I found that really interesting. Congrats to Tim Duncan for having Tim Duncan Day in San Antonio. I know Tim Duncan is really one of the least outspoken legends of all time in any sport, and I don't think he really cares too much about this, but I'm sure it means maybe a little something to him. So transitioning, we're going to be talking Shaquille O'Neal, NBA Hall of Famer, had quite the thing to say about Duncan on the big podcast with Shaq on Monday. He discussed Duncan's place in the pantheon of the NBA's best in the aftermath of the 40-year-old's retirement, and Shaq went on to say, I only have one beef with how they're throwing this around. They're saying he's one of the greatest big men. Do you count power forwards as big men? Because I don't. I was always taught that the big man was a center. I know we got new rules, and they don't have the center spot no more, but no. So Shaquille O'Neal does not count Tim Duncan as one of the best big men of all time because he feels the big man should be considered a center. People like himself, Wilt Chamberlain, Bill Russell, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Hakeem Olajuwon. When I think of Tim Duncan, I do consider him a big man, but I understand what Shaq is saying here. Tim Duncan, in my opinion, in his younger part of his career when he was with the Admiral David Robinson, while he did play that power forward position, they both played in the post. More so David Robinson than Tim Duncan. Because you look at Tim Duncan, he did play in the post a lot, but what's that trademark one Tim Duncan shot? It's that mid-range elbow bank shot. That's what Tim Duncan made a future and a career on. Shaquille O'Neal does not count that as a big man because he's not playing necessarily in the post. So I get what Shaq is saying, but I think Tim Duncan's still a big man. Guys who I would not consider a big man, and along with this goes with what Shaq is saying. So guys I would not consider a big man, guys like Dirk Nowitzki. Dirk Nowitzki, 7-footer from Germany, really the first ever stretch 4. 7-footer, steps out, hits the 3. A great perimeter shooter. One of the guys that really invented that fadeaway, one-footed jump shot, really unguardable. With Dirk, when he took that shot, you really had to just hope that he would miss because you can't block it. He's fading away from you. He's 7 foot tall. A guy who's doing that now is a guy like Kevin Durant, recently of the Oklahoma City Thunder and now of the Warriors. But I would consider Tim Duncan a big man because he did play in the post. He played in the post as well as he did in the mid-range. He wasn't Dirk Nowitzki where he stepped out and hit three-pointers. But I do get what Shaq is saying because the way the NBA has changed, what is the NBA now? It's a shooting league and it's a guard league. If you're a good shooter, Steph Curry, Klay Thompson, you're going to have success. If you're a guy who can blow by everybody, like Russell Westbrook, Kyrie Irving, LeBron James, I'll say Derrick Rose before his injury, you're going to have success. You can get by everybody, you can get to the basket. If you can stand there and hit a jump shot at people in your face, you're going to be successful. Steph Curry and Klay Thompson. Now you look at how the power forward has changed, really with the start of Dirk. Look at the Warriors. Draymond Green is a 6'7" power forward. He didn't play at 6'7" like Charles Barkley did. He plays at 6'7" like Steph Curry does. He's a jump shooter, steps out, hits the 3. The NBA is really trying to model the Golden State Warriors with the stretch 4. Look at every big man coming out in this year's draft. Dragon Bender, 7-footer, steps out, hits the 3. Marquise Chris, 6'10", out of Washington, can step out, hit the 3. Skal Labissiere, who went to Kentucky and the Sacramento Kings, can step out at 6'10" and hit the jump shot. That's really the way the NBA is going. Shaq went on to say that he feels like there's never going to be another true center ever, and I agree with him. Back in Shaq's day and prior with guys like Wilt Chamberlain, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, what the NBA was is you dribble the ball up and you would just throw it to the big men in the post and let them do whatever they want. Look at Wilt Chamberlain. How do you think he scored 100 points in a game? He also had 55 rebounds in a game. He was way bigger than everyone else. No one could guard him. No one even had a chance against him. The NBA is never going to go back to that. The NBA is going to keep evolving even more. You're going to have guys that are going to be centers that are going to just shoot threes. You already have your guards. You already have your small forwards. Pretty much every single team is going to be a three-point shooting team, I'd say within the next 5 to 10 years. The art of the true center is dead. I would consider Tim Duncan a big man, though, but I do get what Shaq is saying. Because Tim Duncan was really, I would say he's kind of like a tweener. He was sort of a fundamental big man, and then he added a mid-range game where he could step out, make you have to really honor that with how he could hit that bank shot. So I get what Shaq is saying, but come on. Tim Duncan is the greatest power forward of all time. A power forward is a big man. At least with Tim Duncan in my eyes. In the current time, I would not consider a power forward a big man, because the current power forward is just a big or small forward. But Tim Duncan, in my opinion, one of the last great big men in the NBA. But Shaq, I do get what you're saying. I do agree with you, but not on Tim Duncan. Anyways, that's going to conclude this episode of the Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Once again, I'd like to thank Mr. Tate for joining me talking some MMA at the first segment of the show. Going to be recording another show. Going to be talking about fellow recently retired NBA legend Kobe Bryant. He wrote a letter to himself, a 17-year Kobe Bryant. He wrote a letter basically going back to if he was 17 years older, a letter to himself at 17. Going to be talking about that. Going to be talking as well as about Clayton Kershaw. I talked a little bit about in this show. Going to be breaking down more about his back injury with the Dodgers, what it means for Kershaw, what it means for the Dodgers as a whole. Then we're going to end our next episode here at the Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast with our ever-popular What's Trending. We got people like Jeremy Lin on there, Alfred Morris, as well as the Madden NFL game. We have the top 10 rated rookies released in Madden. Going to be breaking that down, as well as some jersey sales. So make sure you look out for that, and it will be uploaded tomorrow, Friday, July 22nd. This is going to conclude this episode. I thank you for listening. Again, I am Ben. Alex is not here. He's in San Diego, but Alex would normally be here. Just real quick, what I also forgot to mention is that you can find us on all over the place. Our main website is gsmcpodcast.com. That's where all our portfolios of podcasts are. You can find us on YouTube. We're on Twitter and Instagram at gsmc_sports. So make sure you check that out. You can find us, if you're looking for a mobile way, you can find us on SoundCloud, Stitcher, Google Play. I think I mentioned YouTube, GSMC Podcast. We're also on iTunes. iTunes is really big for us, so make sure that if you're on iTunes, you definitely leave us a comment, give us a rating. We would really appreciate that here at the GSMC Sports Podcast. Again, I thank you for listening, and I hope you guys did enjoy, and have a nice day. Goodbye.